Hi, so I'm going to preface this entire video by saying I'm from the UK. I'm not really well versed at all in the American retro market, but I've heard quite mixed things about the prices of N64 games specifically. That said, this random website tells me that the prices are roughly similar, so I'm going to trust that and still act like this is applicable to everyone in both PAL and NTSC regions, which it probably isn't. Also, I don't own a capture card, so instead enjoy this lovely footage of me and my wife playing Mario Kart 64 instead. With all of that out of the way. So I'm a student, and like most students, I'm completely broke most of the time. Between all of my expenses, I don't usually have that much money at the end of the week, but what little is left goes right towards my hobbies if I'm not doing anything specific. But out of those, retro gaming is one of the more exceedingly expensive ones, and there's not really a lot you can do with 4 or 5 quid. I mean, sure you can emulate, but a lot of people, including myself, are about that original hardware feel with original controllers and physical cartridges or discs you can just put on a shelf and inevitably leave for 5 months before remembering you even bought it. But with prices like this, a lot of people my age feel quite discouraged from getting into the consoles that we owned when we were kids. Specifically, PS2 and GameCube prices are through the roof right now because of the nostalgia wave. But what if we went for something a little bit older instead? Something that's already had its nostalgia wave die out, and it's a console that sadly most people aren't interested in picking up anymore. This is obviously the N64. It's probably the cheapest console you can get into right now for retro gaming, and you can play the vast majority of its classics lineup for around £100 total. But where I think it really shines is how many hidden gems that you can pick up for like £2 to £6. So I'm going to walk through every single bit of kit that you're going to need, and I'm going to go through a list of games that are each less than 10 quid, which I personally think are worth picking up. I think that's about $15. As well as some recommended mods after that, and peripherals, which absolutely are not necessary, but if you really want to get into the hobby, you know it's worth it. And then I'm also going to talk about some considerations for longevity of the console, because this is, at the end of the day, a 30-year-old bit of hardware. It's going to take a little more taking care of than your PC or your Xbox or whatever. So the first bit of kit that we're going to need is obviously the N64 itself. It comes in a bunch of different colours, but the cheapest one you're going to find is almost certainly this black colour, which is sort of the base colour for the console. Thankfully they didn't make the same mistake that they made with the SNES and the NES of having a grey base colour, because those have a tendency to turn to the colour of piss over time, which is just a pain. It's a pretty simple console layout. You've got your power button, your reset button, and then your cartridge slot up here, which I'll get back to later, but then there's this thing in the middle. For those completely unacquainted with the N64, that's the expansion pack port. So if you open it up, you'll see there's something already in there, and you might think, oh, is that the expansion pack? No, that's the jumper pack, which, as the name implies, is just a jumper that makes it so that your console can actually boot. The N64 originally only came with 4 megabytes of RAM, so if you swap out the jumper pack in there for an expansion pack, which brings it up to 8, and costs you about 50 quid, you can play certain games at higher resolutions, as well as a few expansion pack exclusive titles. Don't worry, there's not many of them at all. I'll put all the ones on screen right now that matter. See, not many, and the rest of them are just kind of like bonus features for having an expansion pack. If you play on a modern flat screen like me, I would say this is worth it, but it's not necessary. As you can see, I've still not bothered to pick up one yet because I have no interest in playing the 3 specific games that actually require it. Then, at the very back, we have our display out and our power brick. This is where I want to talk about something exclusive to the PAL N64, which no one seems to talk about but is very important. And that is, if you own a PAL N64, do not buy non-PAL AV cables. Most of the aftermarket ones you'll see are designed for NTSC consoles, which have a slightly different picture calibration to PAL consoles. This results in your game looking like this, which is super washed out and kind of unplayable in my opinion. I'm going to link the cables I personally use in the description. These work with SNES all the way up to GameCube. Don't bother forking out the money for proper, genuine ones, it's just not worth it. These have really good picture calibration. I also would not recommend buying an AV to HDMI adapter. Lots of people recommend this because it has automatic picture calibration. I don't. These add quite significant latency to the console unless you fork out the big bucks for some really expensive ones like the Retro Tink. If you're buying from a company like CEX in the UK, they will bundle cables with the console, but in a lot of cases these will be the NTSC ones, so you will have to go out of your way to buy PAL AV cables. Then we have, obviously, the most iconic part of the N64, which is the controller. These things are really charming in my opinion. A lot of people are either in the love it or hate it camp. I'm very firmly in the love it camp. They work really well considering the age. You might end up with a few defects between each controller. For example, this one that I'm holding right now has a kind of squishy C-right and a weird D-pad, but it's nothing majorly concerning that affects my ability to play games. What surprised me the most, though, about both of my controllers is the complete lack of stick drift. So anyone that's owned a console in the last 20 years knows the absolute agony of stick drift. It requires really constant maintenance to avoid. It is possible, by the way. I own the same two controllers for the entire lifespan of my Xbox One and I did fine. It's just a really lengthy process which nobody really wants to do. The N64 stick doesn't have this problem, or I guess solves it by not really being a stick at all. This thing genuinely has more in common with a computer mouse than one of the potentiometer-based sticks found on modern controllers. This has meant that it's aged quite a bit better than some of the other controllers from the time, specifically the PlayStation 1. Despite the weird shape, I recognise that's a pain point for some people. You do kind of have to remember that at the time we didn't know whether 3D was going to be a gimmick or not. This controller kind of safeguards against that by making sure that Nintendo could always switch back to making 2D games if they wanted to. We've also got this little slot on the back, which is officially called the controller pack connector. Dumb name. I'm going to get a little bit nerdy here, but I think it's worth explaining now so I can contextualize some of the reasons I think the peripherals later are worth it. You may have noticed on the physical console itself that there's no memory card, like there is with the PlayStation 1 or other disc-based systems of the time. You might think, does this mean that the game save is stored entirely on the cartridge? The answer is sometimes. When making a game for the N64, the developers had like 3 main options with an extra 4th option that only really got used for a handful of games. The first is EEPROM, which is a very small type of memory useful for storing very basic information. EEPROM's really cheap, quite reliable, but not really great if you want to store a lot, since for the N64 you had a maximum of 16 kilobytes to work with. The second is onboard SRAM, which is also referred to as battery saves. This is 256 kilobytes or so of onboard memory powered by a little small watch battery type thing that continuously refreshes it. This was really popular with Nintendo first-party offerings, but quite expensive, which drove the cost of producing one cartridge through the roof. Which, if you know anything about retro gaming history, was one of the big issues with the N64 to begin with. And finally, the third option is the point of this little slot on the back, which is the controller packs, which were also 256 kilobytes of SRAM, but packed into a tiny little box that can store game data, so it was kind of offloaded from the manufacturers to have that cost. There's additional accessories that can also go in that slot, but in terms of cheap ones, the controller pack is the only one actually worth getting. My recommendation is to buy 2 controllers and a single controller pack when you buy your console. The N64's lineup thrives on local multiplayer, and although the single-player offerings are really stellar, I think there's still a hell of a lot more fun to be had with multiplayer. As for the controller pack, it's just a sanity thing. There's plenty of games you're going to want to play through that would require you to beat it in one sitting if you didn't have one of them. Just play through the game, wipe all the data, use it for the next game. It doesn't really matter that much. Now, I kind of want to speak about the games in a little bit of a unique way. There's some amazing games in the N64 library which I'd love to talk about, but those games are all worth 20 quid each or more, which I think kind of dilutes my point about how this is great for cheaper retro gaming. So, I've set myself a kind of arbitrary restriction that I'm only going to show off 5 games from the console's library that I picked up personally for less than 10 quid, which I'll have the CEX price displayed for comparison on the side. So, the first game is F-Zero X. When many people think about F-Zero, the first game that naturally comes to mind is GX, which, while I think is really great, I don't think it has half the charm of the game that I'm holding right here. F-Zero X is, in my opinion, the peak of anti-gravity racers, which is a genre that most people don't even care about nowadays. It's one of the few games on the console, or it might be the only one, I'm not sure, to run at 60 frames per second, and you really feel the difference, especially if you're used to the 24 FPS of other titles. It's really amazing fun with friends, and it also has really good single-player offerings. Beating the highest difficulty is an absolute challenge. It nearly made me go insane, especially the track Big Hand. Anyone who's played F-Zero X will know exactly what I'm talking about, but it has to be one of my favourite memories with the console, booting it up and seeing that unique title screen for beating the highest difficulty. Expect to be challenged quite a lot. This game is really unforgiving, but it never feels too unfair or too bullshit. So I don't think the second game needs much introduction at all. This is obviously GoldenEye. It's a very early FPS, so it might be a little bit uncomfortable to those of you that are more familiar with modern shooter games, but it's still extremely fun, especially if, like me, you're a big fan of the movie. This game can take getting used to for other reasons than the controls too, running at a frame rate that varies from 24 FPS to just no. But I think this is Rare's best game on the N64. Though there's a bunch of really, really good titles, I don't think things really get as good as this. Then we've got Lilac Wars. Most of you will know this by its more popular name, which is Star Fox 64. The PAL version received a different title, but it's still the exact same game. I think out of my entire collection, this is the game with the single most replay value out of all of them. Every couple weeks, I just go back and play it again, and I find myself craving to do one more run. I still haven't even scratched the surface of the game. There's tons of medals and bonus challenges, and I think there's an entire alternate boss fight that you can do. I was initially quite put off by the on-rails camera perspective. I know, like, that's kind of a bad thing to have in a flight sim. Well, not a flight sim, but a flight game. But the game features really long all-range sections, they're called, where you have complete control of your craft, and it's in this perspective that the amazing multiplayer game mode is played. I would say this game is quite overshadowed by the more recent and more famous entries in the Tom Clancy series of games. But I think Rainbow Six Siege for N64 is a really unique and impressive experience for the console. Rainbow Six was one of the best shooter games of 1998, so to see it ported to the N64 a year after its release on PC must have been mind-blowing for people at the time. You gotta kind of know what you're getting into with this game. It's very slow, it's very deliberate, very punishing, but I think that's part of what makes it so nice. You have to do these meticulously planned insertions, or you can just go guns blazing if you know how to do it, and both of them feel like they're very fleshed out and dev-intended playstyles. I think this is a really good demonstration of how far shooters came on the N64 in comparatively quite a short time, and it's honestly an absolute steal for the price you can get it at. My final pick is kind of a weird one. I just had to talk about this game a little. Top Gear Rally is a really strange inclusion amongst all of these critically acclaimed games that I've just mentioned, but it's just fun. It's on the more simulation style of races for the time, but that means nowadays it would be considered more of an arcade racer. The physics feel absolutely amazing, and all of the different surfaces that it has, obviously since it's a rally game, they all feel like distinct enough to be believable. And the music, oh my god, they went way too hard for this game. The jungle theme specifically is just genuinely so good that it's distracting at points. The game also has a neat speedrun scene too, if you're kind of into that with your retro games. It's dominated by this one Halo runner that's really nice. It's got some cool tricks. I think it's a really neat game. Now, next, I wanted to talk about peripherals for a little bit. This is going to be a little bit all over the place, since I'm going to need to explain the necessity of a few of these, though hopefully it should be relatively understandable based off the information that I've already given. So, first off, the most economic thing that you can own by far is a Summer Kart 64. The very sad truth is, if you're like me, there's going to be a few games that you're not going to be able to purchase but really want to play. The ones that immediately come to mind for me are Mario Party 3 and the very impressive port of Resident Evil 2 to the console. These games are just worth far too much money for most people to justify. I believe Mario Party 3 is about 100 quid and Resident Evil 2 is even more than that. This is where the Summer Kart 64 comes in. It's just a flash kart, but it's open source, it's cheap, you can get it for about 40 quid off of AliExpress. and most importantly, it spits in the face of the ludicrously overpriced EverDrive. There's also naturally a huge ROM hacking scene for the N64, specifically with Ocarina of Time, so getting to play some of those ROM hacks on original hardware is definitely worth it. Yeah, I think that's probably the most economical peripheral. The next one I wanted to talk about is the Forever Pack 64. So, you might remember earlier I mentioned the controller pack SRAM. Anyone that owns a Game Boy can tell you that eventually those batteries do run dry, and it just so happens that the N64 controller pack batteries run out after about 25 to 30 years. Now, if you look at the year now, I imagine you see the issue. So you can either just get an original controller pack and change the battery, which gives you about another 20 years of worry-free gaming, or you could just get a Forever Pack. These work off of like much more modern memory, which doesn't require a battery, and that makes them theoretically last forever. I can't personally recommend this. The jump from a £5 memory pack to a 27 quid one, which is it holds the same amount of memory. I can't justify that purchase. However, I do recommend, if you can, getting one of these. Next is the peripheral that you will pray you will never need, but you are likely to need it. It's the Joey 64 cartridge flasher. Like with the controller packs, game cartridges with battery-based SRAM, there's about a dozen of them. They're all ticking time bombs, which can be quite inconvenient for longer games that use the format. Big one is Ocarina of Time. It's very likely that the next time I boot up my completely 100% completed Ocarina of Time save, that everything I did will be gone because the batteries run dry. The Joey 64 stops this by allowing you to back up and restore your data from these SRAM cartridges, so you can just back up all your saves, and then when your batteries run out, you can replace them and restore them. The price is a bit steep, it's almost 50 quid, so I recommend this one even less than the other ones, but I just don't want to present problems that this console has without giving solutions. Yes, these problems exist, but the community is amazing and they have found ways around it. And then the final thing I wanted to mention is that you can just make an N64 region-free with completely trivial mods. I'm not going to explain how, this video isn't even about that, but you can be playing Japanese-only games on a non-Japanese N64 completely fine, and it doesn't require that much know-how whatsoever. So, there's my hopefully much more budget-friendly introduction to owning an N64. It's a console that I love. I quite literally trade out having one extra bottle of soda a week for an extra game in my library, and I think that's insanely cool. I'm going to address a few immediate things people might point out here, just so that I cover my bases. Yes, the PlayStation 1 has a slightly cheaper setup cost, and is a hell of a lot more plug-and-play. However, the games can be a lot pricier on average. The cheapest games are usually around £5 to actually get them in the box, but certain games absolutely skyrocket. I'm looking at you, Armored Core 1 boxed for 85 quid. Second thing you may notice is that my wife is shit at Mario Kart. I am fully aware, don't worry. This is my first video on this channel. I hope it was even somewhat enjoyable, and thank you for watching all the way until the end. If you have any questions, feel free to put a comment or message me on Tumblr. I am absolutely happy to help. Bye!